To start our demo today, we're going to mix first three values, white, black, and middle gray. From those three, we're going to also create two additional values, light gray and dark gray, so that we'll have the full spectrum as we begin working on our block 10 painting. To start, you're going to want to establish the basic small spots of value that give you the dimensions of your notan. So our first step is to create the notan on the canvas. Here you see me using the short, smaller knife to outline the basic areas where the notan lies. So working from that photograph of the snow, we're working in the shadows, those dark shadows first, and then we will work on the basic bottom edge of the notan and move up to where the top of the trees meet the sky. It's very important while you're doing this that you use light touches, very light touches. Notice that I'm not drawing or simply outlining the forms, but I'm using light touches of paint to create a basic understanding of where those big, broad shapes are. Remember that when you're working in black and white, the notan is going to be established in black, but that if you're working in color, you will establish the notan with the underlying shadow color that you see in the landscape, still life, or figure. So we're going to start, since this is a black and white painting, we're going to start blocking in with the black dark value so that we quickly get that basic notan established. Here you see that I've switched to my larger knife. It's really important when you're blocking in that you use the largest knife or brush that you have available. That's going to allow you to very quickly establish those large shapes and also help to make sure that you are applying the paint thinly. Very important when you're working in a direct painting method, which is what we're processing through right now, that you use the largest knife or paintbrush available and that you apply that initial layer of paint, that initial blocking in thin layers. That's so that you can go back on top of it with other values of paint without having too much mixing occur. So here you see in just a matter of a few seconds, I have the top of that notan established, and I can move right on to the bottom of that shape. I'm working carefully to leave a few small holes there towards the middle of the tree line, because there was an area where you could see through to the sky beyond, and it's going to be much easier to include that if I don't cover up that area entirely. So I'm leaving a small space for a tree hole. Working down to the bottom of the notan shape. And there we almost have our entire notan established. Again, very quickly. You want to have that happen very fast without overthinking it too much. Notice how much space, how much form you get simply with that establishment of the balance of lights and darks. Now, in making this painting, I decided to go with the predominantly dark notan. So I am working with mainly dark values in there. with a fewer number of lighter values. So it's predominantly dark, but you notice a balance between the light and the dark. So it's around 65, almost 70% dark here. Notice that I'm not worrying too much about the edges of shapes or in making those lines of the tree forms at the top be solid lines. When I work back in on top of it with the additional values, those areas are going to be blended a little bit between one value and the other. So I'm not super concerned about making those either solid or very thick. Again, keep that paint fairly thin. Wipe the blade often so that you're not picking up too much paint. Just like with the flat number 81 blade, you want to pick up about 1/4 of an inch of paint on the back of the knife if you're using a knife, and about the same with a brush. Once I have those big shapes in, I can use the smaller knife to get into these smaller areas when I need to. But I can also switch back and forth with the large knife and the small knife. Try to only pick up the small knife or brush when you have a very small area to work with. Don't be tempted to pick up the small knife simply because it feels more like a pencil or more like a small brush. Keep those big tools in your hands as much as you can. Notice that when I put down thicker paint, I'm spreading it out so that I'm not having large areas of super thick paint. So remember, when we're blocking in, you quickly establish the basic shapes and basic values. Once you have the notan in there, then you are going to assign one value for each of the other shapes in your painting. Lots of times when people paint in the sky, they think of it as being white or super, super light. But in reality, if you use that viewfinder that I have talked about before of the piece of 3 or 4 inch card with a hole punched in it, and you look through that at the values of what you're trying to observe, especially in the sky, you'll notice that those values are actually gray, middle gray. They're lower down, they're darker than you realize. So make sure that you're carefully analyzing the values in the sky. And in this case, since I'm painting snow and it's inherently white in value, but actually much darker than we tend to paint it. Especially in the late afternoon when there are shadows on the snow, it is going to pick up lots of other reflected values around it. So paying attention to where those are and applying them will help you to figure out the basic overall shape relationships and value relationships there. So the main value in the snow is white. I don't have to go in and paint all of that at this point. I can consider the canvas, the white of the canvas, to have established the overall value in that area. So at this point, I've actually moved beyond just the simple block-in stage to beginning to finesse it. So the block-in does not have to take a great deal of time at all. So now I'm beginning to break up those simple shapes into more complex shapes. So I'm looking at where those darker values might have some lighter values that break up the larger dark shapes. One of the things that you can do as you're working back and forth between one area and another is to think about where those shapes meet. Now, one reason that I use the strategy of working from dark to light and putting that notan in first is that that dark value will stay underneath on the canvas or panel even when I pull lighter values across it. So here you can see me pulling out that lighter value of the sky from an area where it overlapped or ran over the dark. Because the dark is underneath, when I pull off the lighter value, the dark is exposed at almost the same value it was initially. But at this stage, you can start to work the edges of the shape and either make them softer or maintain the hard, crisp edge. It's very useful, even when you're working with a brush, to take that number 81 flat-edged knife and use it to go back in and remove paint from some areas. Don't feel like you're wasting it. You can put that paint back on your palette and use it for other areas. But go ahead and scrape back where you need to, where the paint has gotten too thick, or where you need to modify or work those edges some. So here I am getting ready to break up that dark mass of the notan with a next value up. Because although it's late afternoon and there's not an incredible amount of sunlight, there is a degree of light that's falling on the woods and letting some areas be lighter than others. As I'm painting, I can leave some of those darks open where the tree trunks emerge from within the masses of the leaves. But as you're applying those next values on top of the notan, think about the block-in stage and think about where those middle and dark grays go. This is approximately a middle gray value, and it's being applied to the lighter areas of the woods to make there be some push and pull between things that are further away and in shadow and things that are somewhat illuminated. Keep that sketchbook out so that you can look at your sketch while you're working. Okay, notice here how I break that dark up some more with a light gray, almost the exact same value as the sky. That's creating a sense that there's sky holes in that far left tree. So instead of trying to paint around small holes, it works so much better to blot the mass in and then come back on top of it with any lighter values that you want to use. Because those darks were fairly thin, at this stage, putting those lighter values on top means they're not going to mix that much. This is going to be true whether you're working with oils or with acrylics. It really does not matter which media you're using. The technique is virtually the same. You have to get used to the viscosity of the paint, its slipperiness as you're applying it. If it's more slippery paint, like the lesser grades of oil paints, or acrylics is inherently more slippery than best grade oil paints, then you need to hold the tool, whether it's the brush or the knife, more on its side and apply less pressure. The more pressure you apply, the more paint is going to smear into each other. So work on getting that very light touch so that your paint does not blend as you're applying it. That's another reason to work from thin to thick. As you work from thin to thick, the thicker paint will sit on top of the thinner paint. Another reason that not to wait for that notan and block in to dry is that you have the option to selectively blend where those colors are overlapping and create another strong sense of edge and form. That's one reason I recommend the Golden Open acrylics if you're going to work in acrylics in the workshop, because it gives you more flexibility as you are learning to work in direct painting methods to decide whether you want to have a hard edge or a softer edge. So here I'm going back into the edge of those trees and lightly adding some more of that lighter gray to break those shapes up a little bit more. Again, think simple to complex. If you make a mistake, if there's something that you don't like as much when you apply it, it is very easy to remove it with either medium by just taking that flat-edged knife and pushing the paint away and onto the back of it. Then again, you don't have to throw the paint away. You can save it, put it down on your palette, and you can use it for later. Here I'm beginning to block in some of the very light grays in the snow that's at the front of the woods. Using the large knife to do that. Again, the large knife or the large brush will cover a great deal of territory very quickly. It's very important as you work to wipe your knife as you go, especially as you move, or your brush, especially as you move from one value to another. If you don't wipe as you go, you're going to blend and have more than you intend to and not have as much control over what you're doing. So make sure that you have a paper towel in hand and that you wipe your knife as you go so that when you move from one value or color to the next, you're not picking it up. So here I'm working back into those areas that I call sky holes, that are the openings between the trees, and adjusting and deciding exactly where I want those to go. You do not have to be tied to what you see precisely in the photograph. If you feel the need to add more or add less, do so. You're the artist, you're the editor, you get to make those decisions yourself. So I can adjust the edge where the woods meets the snow, what is normally grass when there's not a whole pile of snow on the field. And I can look at the transition from the white to the black. So I'm putting thicker paint down at first, and then I'll go back and scrape and blend and manipulate that so that it works in and becomes part of the composition. Right now it's standing out, and I'm going to want to work back into it to make it become an integral part of the painting and not be the most thick section in the painting. One thing I want to point out is where my fingers are on the knife. As the knife comes back into the picture plane, I want you to look where my index finger is. It is resting on the metal of the knife, on that handle, metal part of the handle, the bent part. That helps to control the pressure. So one way that you can control the knife more is by using your index finger to control and push and press to achieve different variations of pressure. Same is true for the brush. Hold it in the exact same way. Remember, it's not a pencil. Don't hold it and choke it like it's a pencil. It will limit the amount of marks that you can make, and it will actually also limit the control that you have over either the brush or the knife. You can see already at this stage we have 5 to 6 values, and we are getting a great deal of space developing within the painting. It's not finished yet, but we've already got a sense of foreground, middle ground, and background with a fairly simple range of values. So here I'm going back and adding some lighter values to those sky holes on the left so that it will mimic the value of the sky as it moves down towards the horizon line. I call this part of the painting, of the blocking in stage, the dance. Because what you're really doing is working back and forth from one shape area to another, from one edge to another. You are scraping back paint as much as you are applying paint. So think of scraping back and removing paint as being just as important as actually applying paint. Give yourself a chance to remove paint as well as apply paint. So here you can see me removing some of that middle gray value that I'd put up in the upper right hand corner after I decided that it was too thick and not quite the value that I was working on. So I used the smaller knife to pull it off. Then I picked up the larger knife and some darker value to work back into it. That darker value is going to create a much more interesting edge and separation between the trees and the sky itself. The more you're into the painting, the more time you need to spend thinking about what you're going to do as well as actually doing. In fact, it's a really good habit to work in a space that's large enough for you to get back from what you're working on. So stand back. If you can stand back, it's easier to see what your next step is. So here I'm bringing some darker values back into the left-hand side and thinking about where I might need to put them later on the right. So it's also a dance between the smaller knife and the larger knife. One of the things that you don't want to do is to leave super hard edges between the shapes. And you also want to break up those lines. I could have left it as abstract as it was, but I wanted to give the silhouette of the trees against the skyline a little bit more tree-like silhouette, to break it up and make it a little bit more complex. So I went back in with the smaller knife and applied small amounts of paint with the very flat edge of the knife up into the sky, and then went back into those tree holes in the center of the composition as well. I'm going to treat them in the same way that I did the sky and the silhouette of the trees at the top, and try to break that up a little bit more, feather it a little bit, and do that dance back and forth between the darks and the lights. So where I applied middle gray before, now I've picked that light gray back up again, and I can, in essence, carve away at that middle gray by laying light gray on top of it. I really like to think of painting as not being that much different from sculpture, where you're shaping space through the way you apply the different values that you're working with. Each mark is very small, not particularly large at all, but the sum total of all of those small marks becomes much greater than any of the individual marks. Think about the direction that you're making marks as well. The direction that you're making a mark indicates the direction of the plane of the object. The plane is the way that it sits in space. So think of them as boxes, and you're working with the different edges of the boxes to give them a somewhat three-dimensional shape. So you want the direction of the mark to help indicate that. That's one reason to use thicker paint as you begin to build up the painting. That thicker paint helps to indicate where those shape relationships and spatial relationships happen. One of the biggest things I see happening with beginning painters, or painters who are just not as classically trained, is that they work with super, super thin paint, and I guess because they feel like they have more control, and it looks more like a photograph. It has the flatness of a photograph rather than the thickness and the texture of a painting. Painting is about the material of paint. So make sure that people can tell you've got paint on that painting. It should vary from thick to thin. That thick to thin interplay really helps to add to the composition. Don't forget that texture and surface are part of the composition. And in painting, the texture and the surface comes from the physical quality of the paint as well as any illusion that you might be making. So here towards the end of the process, I am working down in the foreground to create a little bit more depth and sense of light in those shadows. One of the things that I found so interesting about that particular photograph was the way the shadows played across the snow, particularly the interaction of the two sort of tree shadow systems. It's almost like there's a separate system on the left and the right, yet the thin little spindly lines of gray join the two together. So that's what I'm trying to capture in this section, and also trying to work on the integration of the edge of the wood with the edge of the field. So with each mark, don't forget, wipe, because I'm working with lighter grays on top of white. I want to make sure that I've wiped off the knife so that I'm not creating more blending on the painting than I intended to. So with that last mark, I pulled the snowfield forward and pushed the forest back. The paint's thicker and it's laying on top of the dark. That creates a sense of overlap and space. So at this point, it's just the final touches, adjusting values as I stand back and look, lightening up certain areas of the sky, leaving others a little darker. Working the light on top of the dark helps again to create a strong sense of space and depth. Carefully adding light gray on top of the middle gray, I'm able to create the illusion of some smaller gray tree trunks going up into the sky, because I'm leaving a space between the light gray marks, that it creates that sense that there's a lighter tree that's in front of the darker tree. And again, at any point, you could decide that you're going to leave it more abstract and you're going to stop, and it'll be a loose painterly expression of a landscape. You can also continue breaking up those values into smaller sections and making it much more photo representational. It's completely up to you. So here I'm working on the angle of that shadow and trying to adjust it a little bit so it looks a little bit more like that tree trunk is standing out in front of the rest of the woods. So adjusting the spatial relationships. And there it's the end.